declaring an integer variable, right? Int x comma y. That means you got a variable x and you're storing an integer value. This variable like this is just a placeholder. You got a variable y and you are going to store values in these variables. If you look at the next one, int z, and you are initializing it to 10. So I'm declaring the variable in this declaration. I'm declaring the variable and I'm giving it a value as well. So here we are initializing. We are initializing a value to that variable. Now, I'm saying these are primitive data types. So what do I mean by primitive data types? Primitive data types are int, you got your float or double, both are, float or double, and you got char, and you got Boolean. So these are primitive data types, right? But if you look at string is not part of that list. If you look at a string, it's not a primitive data type. If I have a string variable is now an object. So the question that obviously you have to ask yourself is, what's the difference between a primitive data type and an object? What's the difference between these two? Basically, a primitive data type, when I use my variables x, y, and z, the only thing I can do is store a value in it. So x equals 500. Pretty much, that's all I can do. I can just store a value. With a string variable, yes, I can store a value. I can say st equals hello. I need to get used to the idea of using double quotes because in Delphi we use single quotes. And I need to get used to the idea of putting a semicolon, right? So here I've got this variable st and I'm storing the value hello into this variable st. And it's just at this stage you would say, but it's the same as your primitive data type because you're putting a value in it. But with a string variable, I can then use the dot and I can say replace. Replace is a function you can use on strings. There's another function called dot contains. I'm not sure if you'll have done the section on strings, but when you have a string variable, you can use functions that are related to that particular string, that object. You've got methods. You've got methods that can be used with that variable. So with a primitive data type like x, you never say x dot something. You'll never say that. With a primitive data type, the only thing you're doing is you're assigning it a variable. But with an object, you will use the dot notation because it has methods associated with it. So that's your main difference between primitive data type and objects. Now, when we look at an array is an object. So when I declare an array variable, you will notice that with objects, we can use the dot. I can use the dot. So I'll declare it and I've got methods associated with it. So the minute I say something is an object, you know that the dot notation comes in. How do we declare the array? Very similar. If I do a comparison with if I'm declaring an integer variable and I'm declaring an integer array, the only difference is those square brackets. So when you're declaring an array, you put the data type, square brackets, which means that is an array, and you'll put the name. So that's how you go about declaring an array. This is not complete. You'll see in my next slide how we go about completing the declaration, but I just wanted to show you a comparison. If you are declaring a normal integer variable like x, this is how we are very familiar with something like that. But if you're now declaring an array, then you just add the square brackets to it, and that means now whatever I'm working with, that is an array, it's not a variable.